This episode of our show has been sponsored by Eldermancy, who are about to put out their new Sunken Isles on Kickstarter, coming in February 2022.
Sunken Isles is a seafaring adventure for 5th edition that takes your adventure through a magical island chain with a mysterious deity. This book is also going to include lots of new rules for ships and naval combat.
This adventure has been headed up by Logan, one of our fellow YouTubers. His channel, Runesmith, you should definitely check it out as well. And the Sunken Isles adventure really draws on some different and unique inspiration from what we typically see in your average seafaring adventure. So this is definitely one to keep an eye on. You can follow the links in the description below to be notified when the Kickstarter goes live.
And now, on to this week's episode.
Greetings! My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are workshopping our homebrew fixes for two-weapon fighting in 5th edition D&D.
Two-weapon fighting is a great part of Dungeons & Dragons that a lot of people love the fantasy of, but in 5th edition, it hasn't quite lived up to what we expected that fantasy to be.
In fairness, two-weapon fighting is a pretty niche fighting style in real life, but it is all over our favorite fantasy media, from video games to novels to movies especially. And many of us are inspired by the heroes of fantasy that we see dual-wielding two axes or two swords or anything, or a pair of hammers or anything in between, and cutting down their foes like butter. It's a really great and fantastical archetype, but one that isn't as well supported mechanically in the rules of D&D 5e, especially in compared to its cousins in the forms of archery or crossbows, or certainly in the forms of two-handed weapons and polearms.
So what we want to do today is look at the two-weapon fighting style, talk about some of the fixes that we might implement in order to bring this fantasy to life, but also look at the changes that this might have on the greater game as a whole, and some of the other feats and abilities that we might need to shift in order to make two-weapon fighting relevant.
And of course, this is just an early draft. We're still workshopping these ideas, so we would love to hear your feedback in the comments below.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
So let's kick things off by looking at what the rules for two-weapon fighting are right now, and maybe what some of the problems with that are that they cause.
Right now with two-weapon fighting, when you attack with a light melee weapon, you can use a bonus action to attack with another light melee weapon with your offhand, but you do not get your ability bonus to that attack.
You must take the attack action on your turn in order to benefit from two-weapon fighting, and while you do get one additional attack, you can't use anything other than a light melee weapon, although you can throw the weapons if they have the thrown property. Now, within the rules, there are several ways that we can augment two-weapon fighting. Fighters and rangers get the two-weapon fighting style that lets them add their ability modifier back into that offhand attack damage. And we can also take the dual-wielder feat so we can use non-light weapons with two-weapon fighting, such as long swords and larger axes that usually give us an upgrade from a D6 damage to a D8 damage. And of course, there are some powers and abilities like Hunter's Mark, which add bonus damage to every single attack that we make, but that's where the problems start coming in.
So the problem with two-weapon fighting as it stands, again compared to archery or polearm master or these other great fighting styles, is that this fighting style eats up your bonus action, which for a lot of classes is something that you really want access to. With the feat choices that you're taking, even adding in something like Hunter's Mark, the damage just isn't going to scale as well as if you're a great weapon master polearm fighter or if you're a sharpshooter crossbow expert. The fact that these other options exist that allow another fighter who takes a different fighting style to really ramp up their abilities in combat, while somebody who's trying to live the fantasy of a two-weapon fighter gets left in the dust, is the main issue.
Now, of course, there's a lot of fighting styles and there's a lot of weapons that are not well supported in 5th edition D&D. And so rather than getting into the whataboutism of that, we just want to come out and say that in an ideal world, all the weapons in D&D 5e would be mechanically distinct, but all capable of dealing really, really good damage. Our friend Chris, who has a great YouTube channel over at Treants Monk Temple, has actually done a great video where he breaks down in detail the problems of two-weapon fighting. And so if you're interested in more of the why it doesn't work well, we really recommend you check out his video, because he really goes into detail on the math behind it and why it doesn't work. I would also say that it's also just frankly disappointing that two-weapon fighting isn't really well supported for monks, barbarians, or for paladins even, all of which feel like classes that should be able to benefit from two-weapon fighting in ways that they can't always. For example, if paladins want to use their smite spells, well, that uses their bonus action, so it doesn't really help them to two-weapon fight if they're using those spells. Barbarians often benefit way more from using a two-handed weapon, and even activating your rage is a bonus action, so you can't activate your rage and start flailing away with your two weapons when you start raging. And monks already have their martial arts feature and so many other abilities that consume their bonus actions. And it really feels like these characters should be able to have some benefit to two-weapon fighting as well.
One rule that tends to get ignored by DMs, but if we're going by the rules as written, creates a bit of a clunky mess here, is the drawing and stowing weapons rule. Now, in my opinion, most DMs should just set this aside, especially if you have somebody trying to live the fantasy of a two-weapon fighter. With all of that being said, let's talk about what we want to see from two-weapon fighting, starting with just the fantasy of being a two-weapon fighter.
Fundamentally speaking, we think that what makes two-weapon fighting feel like two-weapon fighting and not using a great weapon is making a lot of attacks. We feel that any sort of solution that looks at two-weapon fighting should immediately start with this as a core premise. We'll have to figure out the right balance, but we've seen a lot of folks that have proposed solutions to two-weapon fighting that give you a flat bonus to damage rolls, or even advantage on attack rolls. And I'm just going to come out and say, I don't think that these things feel like things that are associated with two-weapon fighting. These solutions feel like things that would actually make more sense if we were trying to capture the flavor of either a very accurate attack or a really heavy two-handed weapon. So we want to give that little bit of mechanical dice feel that helps capture the fantasy.
One thing that we have to understand about Dungeons & Dragons is that you are using dice and rules to imply and bring to life a fantasy and imagination. So when you take that into account, we need to use the dice properly to really fulfill that imagination that we have. With two-weapon fighting, rolling more dice and making more attacks fills that fantasy.
And once again, to build off the genius of Chris over at Trinity Monk's Temple, he proposes a really great solution that I 100% agree with. Two-weapon fighting doesn't need to require a bonus action. It just lets you make one additional attack when you have two weapons in your hand as part of the same action. We only need to add the stipulation that it only works on your turn, and it only works once per turn. So a fighter that action surges can benefit from two-weapon fighting once, but not on the second round of action surge attacks. It just adds a full-on additional attack. Amazingly, this solves so many things right off the bat.
This simple solution solves, in my opinion, the biggest issue with two-weapon fighting. By removing the bonus action element of it, you allow rangers to use their hunter's mark and still deliver the two-weapon fighting. Monks can still benefit from all of their bonus action maneuvers. Paladins can still smite. You still get all of your goodies because so many subclasses and classes have beautiful bonus action options that you don't really want them to interfere with your ability to fulfill your basic attacking fantasy. And that's what two-weapon fighting is. It's meant to amplify your basic attack. So let's make it work that way.
Now, taking it a little bit further, and this is just something that I feel in the interest of simplicity, I actually don't like the fact that the offhand attack doesn't innately add your ability score modifier. It's a weird exception. I understand why it makes sense from a game balance perspective, but I think that players forget that. And it ends up being one of those confusing things that in the flurry of making a bunch of attacks, I would rather just scoop up all my dice and roll them and know that they all use the same modifiers and they all use the same stats fundamentally. So I think we should just axe that as a requirement. And instead, let's look at the other two-weapon fighting style and the dual-wielder feat and change these to give them a little bit more love and maybe shuffle a few other things around too.
So the next thing we're going to do is change the two-weapon fighting style so that it allows you to use weapons that aren't light. This is essentially the dual wielder feat, but now instead of taking a feat, you just get to do that by being a class that gets a fighting style. And because we're using the original two-weapon fighting style and just baking it into the rule for wielding two weapons, this just means that by using two weapons and taking the fighting style, you're already well on your way to fulfilling this fantasy.
This does mean that dual wielders come out swinging out the gate, which is pretty powerful and is definitely something that merits a little bit of playtesting. Maybe we've gone a little bit too far in the other direction with making some of these changes, but I would like to try and see how this feels first, because it might be that by making these changes, we need to make changes to a few other things as well. Now, of course, as our characters level up, we would like to introduce a replacement for the dual wielder feat called Dual Flurry. This would be a feat that has a prerequisite that your character must have the extra attack feature or an equivalent feature. And all it lets you do is attack twice when you use two-weapon fighting instead of once.
The result of this is that if you are an 8th level fighter wielding two weapons and you take this feat, you can now make 4 attacks on your turn. Again, if you action surge, you're still only gaining 2 more. This is to prevent the imbalance of a fighter being able to ramp up to 8 attacks at level 6. The last thing we need to do is change the rules for drawing and stowing weapons for all characters. We think that the change here is quite simple. As part of the same action that a character takes on their turn, as long as they have a free hand, they can draw whatever item is needed to perform that action.
This is a blanket rule that would affect all characters and all classes and all actions, and really reflects the way that we play it at the table. That basically, once per turn, you can take out whatever items that you need for what you're going to do on that turn, and you can put items away once per turn as well. So for example, if your character at the start of their turn has a longbow out, you can put that away and draw 2 swords. Or if you have a sword and a staff in your hand and you want to put those away so you can pull out your wand of fireballs and a scroll, that's fine.
And really, that does bring to life that fantasy. If we think of Legolas from Lord of the Rings, when he's sniping people with his bow, and then the orcs charge him into close combat, and he draws his 2 blades. We want to be able to live that fantasy, and it's so much easier for you to be using your bow, and then as soon as enemies are getting close to you on your turn, out come the blades.
So in essence, our changes boil down to 5 main things. Characters make their offhand attack as part of the same attack action when they're using 2 weapons. They get to add their ability modifier to the damage of the offhand attack, and we've changed the two-weapon fighting style to use the original text of the dual wielder feat in allowing non-light melee weapons to be used in this way.
And we've added a new feat for Dual Flurry, which allows you to make an additional attack if you are dual wielding, and we've changed the rules for drawing and stowing weapons to make it easier to pull out both of your weapons. We're actually really excited about these changes, and we think that this unlocks a lot of new archetypes and play styles at the table that I don't really think pushes the power of the game that far. We already have sharpshooter crossbow experts and polearm master great weapon masters. So really, just by adding these few elements in, I don't think that dual wielding actually raises higher than these existing features. But that being said, let's talk about some of these other features and feats and how we might change them to further balance the game.
Now, one thing that we might want to do is look at heavy weapons specifically. So our greatswords, our polearms, and all sorts of other things. And if it turns out that two-weapon fighting, by these changes, pulls ahead of the heavy weapon fighting style, we could inject this new rule. When you hit with a melee attack using a heavy weapon, your character gets to add twice their strength modifier to the damage roll instead of just their strength modifier.
One thing we're not sure of is whether this is just a base rule for heavy weapons, a fighting style that you can choose, or a feat that you can take. We're still workshopping that, but we do think that this further feeds the fantasy of hitting really hard with a big weapon.
As part of the consideration of this, we might even look at the possibility of removing the Great Weapon Master feat, but not the Sharpshooter feat. to add a little bit of mechanical distinction between the differences of these styles. Again, we'd have to run the numbers a little bit more detailed to find the right balance, but the ideal point is that all of these fighting styles, 2 weapons, ranged, heavy weapons, all land in roughly the same spot.
There are a couple feats, though, that we think that we could pull back on to help balance the game a little more, and that is Polearm Master and Crossbow Expert. In the case of Polearm Master, we're going to remove the additional attack option. Instead, Polearm Master now adds +1 to your strength or con, and you still get to make a opportunity attack as a reaction against a creature who enters your reach.
In this case, this is really just pulling it back so that Polearm Master gets to be unique and distinct without taking it into the overboard territory. In addition, we're going to look at the cousin of Polearm Master, Crossbow Expert. And in the specific case of Crossbow Expert, we're going to change the bonus action attack to a line of text that allows a hand crossbow to be used in place of a light melee weapon when a character is using 2-weapon fighting, so long as the other weapon is a melee weapon. This basically means that you can't kind of hammer fire the hand crossbow anymore, while still enabling what we think is probably the original design intent of Crossbow Expert, that being the rapier in one hand, crossbow in the other sort of style that is iconic for many swashbucklers, dark elves, and others.
The main reason why I think pulling back on Crossbow Expert is so important is the way that Crossbow Expert and Sharpshooter work right now really defeats the fantasy of being a bow-wielding character, because you can always be more powerful by wielding a crossbow. And I think that actually takes a lot away from a lot of people's great fantasy of the Legolas, Hawkeye, Green Arrow style characters. So by pulling this back a little bit, you get to be your swashbuckler with the rapier and the crossbow, or there's still a very great case to be made for being a longbow-wielding character.
Now, we can't leave the sword and board style in the dust, and we still think maybe there's more work to be done in this classic fighting style as well to really make it feel mechanically distinct compared to the others. But we're going to start with the Shield Master feat and kind of apply the same rationale to Shield Master as we have to 2-weapon fighting.
For the most part, we like the Shield Master feat, and most of it can stay the same, with a few subtle changes. Like the rules we've implemented for 2-weapon fighting, with Shield Master, we're now going to allow the shove action of the Shield Master feat to be part of the same action as the attack.
This means you could be a smiting paladin using your bonus action to smite and shove someone with Shield Master as part of the same turn. Feels pretty good to me. Now, a few other bonuses that we would consider adding to Shield Master to really bring it up is Shield Master has this provision that you get to add your shield bonus to your dexterity saving throws when you're the only target. Let's just remove that line requiring you to be the only target. I think you should be able to raise your shield when you're getting fireballed, even while the cleric beside you is getting burned away horribly.
So with all of this, these are a lot of rule changes that we're talking about here. Not only are we taking a look at how to make 2-weapon fighting stand out more, but we've also looked at the way that can impact other feats and fighting styles in the game, and trying to balance all of them out equally. Now, again, this is our first draft of this. We are really happy with the rules that we're implementing for 2-weapon fighting, but some of the other ideas that we've come up with, let us know your thoughts on them. And really the goal here is that we want to balance it all out to the 2-weapon fighting changes that we're making, so that all different fighting styles that you can implement feel powerful and useful on the battlefield.
There is a Google Doc in the description below that has the precise wording that we're proposing for each of these attributes. So take a look through that if you want to see if there's not any loopholes left in this whole thing, because we really do want to tighten it up and make sure that it works nicely across a wider range of classes than it currently does.
So this has been a look at our homebrew fixes for 2-weapon fighting in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you've made any rules changes at your table for 2-weapon fighting, let us know how they went in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider joining our community by following the links in the description below.
And don't forget to check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more topics on homebrewing for D&D 5e right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.